Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. So without further ado, let's get started on today's story. Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is presented by Go Loud, Ireland's leading audio publisher and the home of Irish podcasts. Find new episodes on the podcast first on the Go Loud app and on your favourite podcast platform. Before we begin, this episode contains discussion of domestic violence, murder, strangulation and the death of a young woman. Please take care while listening. On the morning of Friday, the 14th of July 2006, a 19-year-old woman didn't show up for her shift at the Rushbrook Hotel in Cove, County Cork. Her name was Sheola Keaney, and she was meant to be working as a waitress that evening. When she didn't arrive, her manager grew concerned. Sheola was reliable. She loved her job. It wasn't like her to miss a shift without calling. Her mother Carol had been trying to reach her all day. No answer. Carol's worry turned to panic. In the early hours of Saturday, the 15th of July, Carol reported her daughter missing to the Gardaí. The last confirmed sighting of Sheola had been in the early hours of Friday morning, around 3:30 a.m, when she'd been chatting with her ex-boyfriend, Thomas Kennedy, at Russell Heights in Cove. For 2 days, Gardaí and volunteers searched the small seaside town. Friends handed out missing persons flyers. Family members walked the streets calling her name. Her father Peter drove from Clonmel to join the search. On Sunday evening, the 16th of July, at around 8:30 p.m, a search party made a grim discovery in a laneway near the Cove Pirates rugby pitch. First they found Sheola's shoes and handbag in the lane. Gardaí cordoned off the area and concentrated their search along the laneway. About 45 metres further on, they found her. Sheola Keaney's partially clothed body was found wrapped in 2 black plastic refuse sacks and carefully concealed under scrap metal, iron sheeting and hedge cuttings in a quiet lane at Newtown. She'd been strangled to death. The man who killed her was someone she trusted, someone she'd loved, her ex-boyfriend of 18 months, a man who would later plead guilty to her murder. This is the story of Sheola Keaney, a vibrant, beautiful young woman with her whole life ahead of her, whose life was stolen by a person who was supposed to care about her. Sheola Keaney was born in 1987 to Peter and Carol Keaney. She spent most of her childhood and teenage years living in Clonmel, County Tipperary with her father after her parents separated when she was young. Peter Keaney, originally from Cove, had moved to Clonmel in the mid-1990s and established a successful hairdressing business in the town centre. He adored his daughter. She was, in his words, the love of my life. By all accounts, Sheola was a striking young woman, tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes. But it wasn't just her appearance that people remembered, it was her personality. While living in Clonmel, Sheola attended Rockwell College, where she excelled at sports, including hockey. She was active, outgoing and full of life. Friends described her as bubbly, caring and someone who could lift your spirits even on your darkest days. One friend said she would lift you up when you were down. When you weren't down, she lifted you even higher. Another friend described her simply as one of a kind. Someone else described her as this tall, striking girl with an endearing personality, with a bomb sight of a bedroom and a huge wardrobe. It was a description that made people smile through their tears, because it captured who Sheola really was. A normal young woman who loved clothes and shopping with her friends. When Sheola was 16 years old, she made the decision to move from Clonmel to Cove to live with her mother Carol. It wasn't because she didn't love her father, quite the opposite. But at the time, Peter's brother Dominic was dying of cancer, so it was felt it would be more appropriate for Sheola to live with her mother in Cove, settling in the Glennar area of the town. It was meant to be a fresh start, a new chapter. In Cove, Sheola had family connections. Her uncle Vincent Keaney had won 1.2 million in the lotto in 1996 and had used his winnings to set up the Titanic bar in town. It was a tight-knit community. Sheola quickly made friends. She worked as a waitress, first at Fota Golf Club, then at the Rushbrook Hotel. She was good at her job, popular with the customers and colleagues alike. And she had plans, big plans. Sheola was hoping to go to University College Cork in the autumn of 2006. She wanted to study. She wanted to build a future. But in January of 2005, about a year after moving to Cove, Sheola met someone, a local man named Thomas Kennedy. He was from Russell Heights in Cove, and Sheola started dating him. From the outside, it might have looked like a normal teenage relationship. They were young. They lived in a small town. They had the same group of friends. In the 18 months that they dated, Sheola's father, Peter, grew increasingly concerned about the relationship. In a published interview with the Sunday Mirror after Kennedy's conviction, Peter spoke about what he'd observed. From day one, I knew there was something there that wasn't right, Peter said. And he was a control freak. Peter described noticing how Kennedy would undermine Sheola's confidence. He recalled that if they were out and another man looked at Sheola, Kennedy would whisper in her ear, "You think you're so good looking. Drop it." Peter said he urged Sheola on numerous occasions to leave Kennedy, but Sheola, like so many young women in relationships where one partner is dominant, didn't act on her father's concerns. In May of 2006, Sheola and Thomas Kennedy did break up. Inspector Martin Dorney testified in court that the couple had been dating from January of 2005 until May of 2006, and that they still saw each other around Cove and had mutual friends after the split. For 2 months after the breakup, Sheola got on with her life. She worked, she spent time with friends, she made plans for university. And then on the night of Thursday, the 13th of July 2006, Sheola went out with friends to a barbecue in Rushbrook. She had no way of knowing it would be the last night of her life. It was the kind of casual gathering you'd expect on a summer's night. Friends, food, music, laughter. At some point during the evening, Sheola and some of her friends left the barbecue and went into town to the Commodore Hotel where there was a disco. After spending some time at the nightclub, Sheola returned to the barbecue in the early hours of the morning. And that's when things took a turn. According to evidence presented at the Central Criminal Court, in the early hours of Friday, the 14th of July, Thomas Kennedy called Sheola. They hadn't been together for 2 months at this point. The relationship had ended, but Kennedy called her. We don't know what was said in that phone call. We don't know if he asked her to meet him, or if she agreed willingly, or if there was pressure involved. What we do know is that Sheola ended up in Kennedy's company that night. At around 3:30 a.m. on Friday morning, another couple saw Sheola and Thomas Kennedy together at Russell Heights. According to witnesses, they were chatting in a perfectly civil manner. A friend who was with Sheola that night later told Gardaí that she'd left Sheola in Kennedy's company. She thought Sheola would be safe. They'd been together for 18 months. The split had been described as amicable. Why would there be any danger? But Sheola never came home. By Friday morning, Sheola Keaney was trying to reach her daughter. No answer. Sheola's phone went unanswered. She didn't show up for work that evening at Rushbrook Hotel. In the early hours of Saturday morning, Carol reported her daughter missing to Gardaí. And Thomas Kennedy? According to Inspector Martin Dorney's court testimony, Kennedy showed up at Cove Garda station soon after Sheola was reported missing. He told Gardaí that Sheola had come back to his house, to his sister's house specifically, in the early hours of Friday morning. He said they'd stayed there, that there had been no sexual activity between them, and that Sheola had left on her own at 10 a.m. on Friday morning. That was the last time he'd seen her, he said. The Gardaí took his statement. There was no reason to disbelieve him at this point. They began searching for Sheola. But here's what's chilling. According to Inspector Dorney's testimony, Thomas Kennedy went on to repeat this version of events to Gardaí on 5 more occasions over the next few days. 6 times he told the same story. And on Saturday, the 15th of July, while Sheola was already dead, Kennedy even suggested to Carol Keaney, Shauna's devastated mother, areas that should be searched. Think about that for a moment. He knew where Sheola's body was. He'd put her there. He'd wrapped her body in plastic refuse sacks and hidden her under scrap metal and iron sheeting in a laneway less than half a kilometre from his house. And he stood there, looking at Carol Keaney in the eye and suggested places to search. For 2 days, Sheola's family and friends searched. They handed out flyers. They walked the streets calling her name. Peter Keaney drove from Clonmel, sick with worry about his daughter. All the while, Thomas Kennedy knew exactly where she was. On Sunday evening, the 16th of July, at around 4:30 p.m, Gardaí searching a laneway near Cove Pirates rugby pitch at Newtown found Sheola's shoes and handbag. They cordoned off the area and intensified the search. About 45 metres further along the lane, at around 8:30 p.m, a search party discovered Sheola's body. She was found in a ditch off the quiet lane. Her body had been wrapped, as I said, in 2 plastic refuse bags. It was covered with iron bars, scrap metal and hedge cuttings. According to investigators, whoever killed Sheola had done their best to make sure she wouldn't be found easily. The body had been very carefully concealed. Sheola was found partially clothed. Some of her clothing had been recovered separately during the search. The state pathologist's office was immediately notified. Assistant State Pathologist Dr. Margaret Bolster conducted a post-mortem examination at Cork University Hospital. Her findings confirmed what Gardaí had suspected. This was murder. Dr. Bolster concluded that Sheola had died from manual strangulation in association with traumatic asphyxia. In other words, someone had strangled her with their hands while simultaneously kneeling on her chest, restricting her breathing. There were also injuries on her back that suggested she'd been pushed forcefully against the wall during the fatal assault. Forensic examination also recovered DNA evidence. A swab was taken from Sheola, revealing semen. DNA testing matched that sample to Thomas Kennedy. The same Thomas Kennedy who'd been telling Gardaí for 2 days that Sheola had left his house alive at 10 a.m. on Friday morning and that there had been no sexual activity between them. The same Thomas Kennedy who'd suggested search areas to Sheola's grieving mother. The same Thomas Kennedy who'd wrapped Sheola's body in refuse sacks and hidden her under scrap metal. With the discovery of Sheola's body, the investigation became a murder inquiry. More than 50 Gardaí from Cork North Division and Cork City Division were deployed. Officers began conducting door-to-door inquiries in Newtown and Rushbrook. The laneway where Sheola's body had been found, a path linking Norwood Hill to the Cove Pirates rugby ground, remained sealed off. Forensic experts from the Gardaí Technical Bureau in Dublin arrived at the scene at approximately 11:30 a.m. on Monday morning and carried out a detailed technical examination. Assistant State Pathologist Dr. Margaret Bolster arrived at the scene just before 1 p.m. She conducted a preliminary examination of Sheola's body at the location where it had been found, spending over an hour at the scene before the remains were transported to Cork University Hospital for a full post-mortem examination. It is understood that Gardaí believed Sheola had been killed early on Friday morning and that her body had been brought to the scene and concealed under the cover of darkness. Inspector Martin Dorney from the Cove Garda Station led the investigation. At a press conference, he told reporters, "We have a number of both uniform and detective teams on the ground working in Cove. At the moment, we are keeping an open mind, but all avenues will be investigated." He confirmed that no one had been questioned in relation to the killing at that point. For operational reasons, he said, the cause of death would not be released publicly, as it would be of benefit to the investigation later on. But that was about to change. Gardaí were piecing together Sheola's last known movements. They knew she'd attended a barbecue in Rushbrook on Thursday night. They knew she'd gone to the Commodore Hotel. They knew she'd returned to the barbecue in the early hours of Friday morning. And they knew from Carol Keaney's statement that Sheola had been with Thomas Kennedy. On Thursday, the 20th of July, 4 days after Sheola's body was found, Thomas Kennedy was arrested at his home in Cove just before 7 a.m. Under Irish law, he could be held for an initial period of 6 hours, with the possibility of a further 6 hours before he had been charged or released. Gardaí questioned him, and this time, his story changed. According to the prosecution's outline of the case at the Central Criminal Court, Kennedy admitted to Gardaí that he'd lied in his initial statements. Shaola hadn't just stayed at his home and left at 10 a.m. He now said they'd slept in separate bedrooms, but had had sexual intercourse that morning. Then they'd had breakfast together, gone for a walk into the laneway at Newtown. And what happened in that laneway? Kennedy told Gardaí that on the spur of the moment he grabbed Shaola from behind with his left arm. He said he went to pull her tight with his right arm, then let go as she fell. That was his explanation, an accident, a grab that went wrong, a fall. But forensic evidence told a different story. The post-mortem findings were clear. Manual strangulation in association with traumatic asphyxia. Someone had strangled Shaola with their hands while kneeling on her chest. This wasn't a grab that went wrong. This was sustained, deliberate violence. And then there was the physical evidence. Forensic examination of one of the black plastic refuse sacks that Shaola's body had been wrapped in revealed a fingerprint. That fingerprint matched a voluntary sample taken from Thomas Kennedy. The DNA evidence matched, the fingerprint matched, and Kennedy had already admitted to lying to the Gardaí multiple times. On Friday the 21st of July 2006, Thomas Kennedy was charged with the murder of Sheola Keaney. A special sitting of Middleton District Court was held that evening. At 8 p.m, Kennedy was formally charged with murdering Shaola at Cove between July 14th and 16th. He was remanded in custody to Cork Prison. The small town of Cove was in shock. This wasn't a random attack by a stranger. This was a young man they knew, a local man who killed his ex-girlfriend and then helped search for her while her body lay hidden in a laneway. But before the trial could begin, Shaola's family and friends had to say goodbye. On Wednesday the 19th of July 2006, the day before Thomas Kennedy's arrest, more than 1,000 mourners gathered at St. Coleman's Cathedral in Cove for Sheola Keaney's funeral. The turnout was extraordinary. The cathedral was packed. People stood outside. The whole community had come together in grief. More than 500 family members, friends and work colleagues had gathered the evening before in a silent mourning to escort Shaola's body from the hospital mortuary to St. Coleman's Cathedral. At the funeral mass, two of Shaola's friends, introduced simply as Lynn and Alexandra, stood before the 1,000 mourners and gave an intimate and touching account of what Shaola had meant to them. Lynn's voice broke several times as she talked about her friend's huge personality and her passion for shopping. She offered kind words to Shaola's parents, Peter and Carl, for the person they had raised. She would lift you up when you were down, Lynn said, and when you weren't down, she lifted you even higher. Alexandra read a poem she had written for the funeral. In it, she said that while friends were easy to find, Shaola was one of a kind. You were there for us, cared for us, and made each and every one of us smile, she read. True friends stick by you through thick and thin, provide a shoulder, a hand, a loving heart. For that, Shaola, we need not forget. Several other friends and relatives choked back tears as they read the mass readings and prayers of the faithful or carried the offertory gifts. Curate John McCarthy, who had gone to Shaola's body when she was found in the undergrowth near Rushbrook, paid tribute to her during the mass. This tall, striking girl who was serving as a waitress at the Rushbrook Hotel where I had lunch 2 weeks ago, he said. These last few days have been so difficult for her family and friends. The whole community is united in grief. Despite all the fine weather, these are dark days. He spoke of the impact Shaola had made on Cove in the 2.5 years since she'd moved there from Clonmel. One has only to look around the church today to see the effects the life and death of Shaola has had, he said. Only in the last 2.5 years she has lived and socialised with many of the teenagers here, and what an impact she has made. He described her as your normal, extroverted and slightly disorganised and at times giddy teenager who was, Above all, a very supportive friend to all, and always had a funny phrase or a witty personal remark to cheer them up. The bishop spoke of the massive loss for those closest to Sheola and called for her killer to come forward and face the consequences of what he called a heinous crime. At the time, Thomas Kennedy had not yet been arrested, but the bishop's words hung heavy in the air. Everyone in that cathedral knew something terrible had happened. Everyone knew this wasn't an accident, that this was murder. Peter Keaney sat in that cathedral devastated. His daughter, his beautiful, vibrant daughter, was gone. Shaola was buried in St. Coleman's Cemetery in Cove. Her mother Carol, her father Peter, family members and hundreds of friends gathered at the graveside. Friends had left tributes on Sheola's Bebo page, the social media platform of that era, describing her as bubbly and caring, a person who would be missed in both her native Tipperary and her new home in Cove. One friend said, "You made each and every one of us smile." Friends also laid bouquets of flowers at the entrance to the laneway at Newtown, where Sheola's body had been found. In a small town like Cove, the murder of a young woman known to so many people sent shockwaves through the entire community. Cove is a small town where people know their neighbours, where young people grow up together. The idea that something like this could happen, that a young woman could be murdered and hidden in a laneway just metres from where people walked every day, was almost impossible to comprehend. The day after Sheola's funeral, Thomas Kennedy was arrested and charged with her murder. Thomas Kennedy's trial was scheduled for December 2006 at the Central Criminal Court sitting in Cork. When he was first arraigned, Kennedy pleaded not guilty to murdering Sheola Keaney at Cove between July the 14th and 16th. The trial began. A jury of 7 men and 5 women were selected. Senior Prosecuting Counsel Patrick McCarthy SC was set to present the state's case. When the charge was put to Kennedy again, as the prosecution prepared to open its case, he reiterated his not guilty plea. In his opening statement, McCarthy outlined the evidence that would be presented. He told the jury that Sheola had been found partially clothed when her body was discovered. He told the jury that DNA evidence would link Thomas Kennedy to semen found on Sheola's body. He explained that Kennedy's fingerprint had been found on one of the refuse sacks her body was wrapped in. And he told the jury about Kennedy's lies. Fingerprints, DNA and lies, McCarthy said, were what linked Kennedy to this crime. He outlined how Kennedy had told Gardaí 6 different times that Sheola had left his house alive at 10 a.m. on Friday the 14th of July. He described how Kennedy had even suggested search areas to Carol Keaney while he knew exactly where Sheola's body was. McCarthy explained that the prosecution would prove that Kennedy's version of events, that he grabbed Sheola and they'd both fallen, was only half-truth at best. The jury would hear from Assistant State Pathologist Dr. Margaret Bolster about the cause of death, manual strangulation in association with traumatic asphyxia. The doctor would testify that the injuries were consistent with somebody strangling Sheola with their hands while kneeling on her chest. Sheola's parents sat in the public gallery, flanked by friends and family. Kennedy's family were also present in the courtroom. But on the second day of the trial, something changed. Thomas Kennedy asked to be rearraigned on the charge. When the charge was read to him again, he changed his plea. Guilty, he said. Thomas Kennedy pleaded guilty to the murder of Sheola Keaney. There would be no trial, no witnesses, no cross-examination. Kennedy had admitted his guilt. The sentencing hearing proceeded. Inspector Martin Dorney gave evidence to the court about the relationship between Sheola and Kennedy. He testified that Sheola had been dating Kennedy from January 2005 until May 2006, a period of 18 months when they split up. But they still saw each other around Cove and had mutual friends. In the early hours of the 14th of July, Kennedy had called Sheola after she'd gone to the barbecue. The two were seen together at Russell Heights by another couple at 3:30 a.m. When Carol Keaney and friends failed to make contact with Sheola later that day, Carol reported her daughter missing to the Gardaí. Dorney testified that Kennedy had lied to Gardaí repeatedly about Sheola's whereabouts, even suggesting areas to search. And then came the victim impact statements. Sheola Keaney spoke directly to her daughter. "I lived for you from the moment you were born," Carol said. "I sometimes dream that I get to the place where you were murdered in time to save you, but I wake up and you are gone. All I can do for you now is look after your grave. This is not right." Peter Keaney addressed the court about the heartache and pain he'd been living with since Sheola's death. "I cannot describe in words the heartache and pain that I am in since my daughter's death," he said. "To lose a child through illness or an accident is heartbreaking, but to lose a child in the way I did, with her basic right to life so cruelly and unjustly taken away from her, has left me devastated." He spoke about his role as a father, to mind Sheola, protect her, guide her and love her. "I did not always get it right," he said, "but she was my reason for getting up in the morning." He spoke about his dreams for his daughter, about walking her down the aisle on her wedding day, about seeing her graduate from university, about grandchildren. But now there will be no wedding day, no 21st birthday, no graduation and no grandchildren, he said. Mr. Justice Paul Kearney sentenced Thomas Kennedy to the mandatory sentence for murder, life imprisonment. Before passing sentence, Justice Kearney said he hoped the swift disposal of the matter, just 11 weeks from when Kennedy was returned for trial to sentencing, would be of some assistance to Sheola's family in trying to cope with their loss. Thomas Kennedy was taken to Cork prison to begin his life sentence. Outside the courtroom, Peter Keaney called on the government to provide extra funding to set up specialist units to counsel and train therapists to help with the psychological impact suffered by the bereaved family and friends of murder victims. He was already thinking about how to help others, how to make sure Sheola's death wasn't completely in vain. For Peter, the sentence didn't feel like justice. Justice, he said, would be having his daughter back. In a published interview after sentencing, Peter described the experience of sitting through the proceedings. "People say justice has been served, but justice has not been served for me," he said. "Wholeheartedly, I'm in bits. There's no other words for it, but I am numb. It was like reburying her again." He spoke about how his brother's death from cancer had devastated him, but Sheola's death, quote, "had blown me away." "Sheola and I loved each other immensely," he said. "We had an incredible relationship. It was a relationship that had been cut brutally short, and now Peter was left to carry on alone." After Sheola's murder, Peter Kearney's life changed completely. He closed down his hairdressing business in Clonmel shortly after his daughter's death. He couldn't go back to his normal routine. How could life just go on as if nothing had happened? Peter's home became what one local described as a shrine to his daughter. There were photographs of Sheola everywhere, in every room, on every wall. One room was still left as a child's room, preserved exactly as Sheola had left it. For Peter, grief wasn't something that faded with time. It was something he lived with every single day. In a published interview in 2009, 3 years after Sheola's murder, Peter spoke candidly about his ongoing pain. "My life isn't the same without Sheola, and I just hope he, as in Kennedy, is in as much pain," he said. "I miss everything about her. I miss her being around. She was the love of my life." He described attending his niece's wedding just after Christmas. "As she was walking up the aisle, all I could think about was, that should be Sheola, and that is the nearest thing I will get to giving her away. It was heartbreaking," he said. Peter was clear about his feelings towards Thomas Kennedy. "I'll never forgive him." But Peter didn't just grieve privately. He channeled his pain into activism. He became active in ADVIC, the organisation for the families of homicide victims in Ireland. ADVIC provides support and advocacy for families who've lost loved ones to murder. Anne Mulvaney, secretary of ADVIC, knew Peter well. She later said, "Peter attended many of our meetings and he was a very nice man. He was deeply traumatised by the death of his daughter and found common purpose with other ADVIC members. Through Advic, Peter found others who understood what he was going through. People who had also lost loved ones to violence. People who also felt that the system was unfair. Like all of us in Advic, Mulvaney said, he was feeling that the system was unfair, and his involvement in Advic was to try to redress that balance. Peter became an outspoken advocate for victims' rights. He highlighted what he saw as injustices in court and prison systems. He called for better support for families of murder victims. He wanted counselling services. He wanted specialist training for therapists who worked with the bereaved. He gave interviews. He spoke at events. He made sure people didn't forget about Shaola. In July 2007, on the first anniversary of Shaola's death, Peter organised a memorial vigil at St. Coleman Cemetery in Cove. A large crowd turned out. Peter was visibly moved by the attendance. At the vigil, he spoke publicly about his determination that Shaola would not become just another statistic. I don't want Shaola to remain a murder statistic, he said. I want Shaola to be remembered for all the right reasons. He also used the occasion to call for reform of sentencing in Ireland, arguing that a life sentence for murder should mean life, not the mandatory term that often resulted in release after a set number of years. If someone takes someone's life, it should be life, not a mandatory life sentence of 25 years, he said. The vigil also heard from another murder victim's family member, the sister of Dundalk woman Irene White, who I covered in a previous podcast, who had been found stabbed to death in April 2005 and whose killer had still not been brought to justice at that point. She spoke about the failures of the legal system and the pain of waiting for justice. It was through events like these that Peter connected with other families who had lost loved ones to violence. He found a community of people who understood his pain, and together they pushed for change. But the grief never left him. How could it? In a published interview after the trial, Peter spoke about his concerns during the relationship. He said he had repeatedly warned Shaola about Kennedy and urged her to leave the relationship. Peter hoped that by speaking out about domestic violence and controlling relationships, he might help other young people recognise the warning signs. Peter's brother, Vincent Keaney, the lotto winner who had set up the Titanic bar in Cove, was also deeply affected by his niece's death. The entire Keaney family were traumatised by what had happened. Peter and Carol had no other children. Shaola had been their only child. The loss was total. For Peter, living in Clonmel while Shaola was buried in Cove meant regular trips to Cork to visit her grave. Each visit was a reminder of what he'd lost. In October 2011, 5 years after Shaola's murder, Peter's neighbours in the area of Clonmel where he lived became concerned. They hadn't seen Peter for a number of days. His curtains were drawn. There was no answer at the door. They raised the alarm. Peter Keaney's body was discovered in the bathroom of his home. It's understood he'd been dead for several days before being found. A post-mortem examination was carried out at Waterford Regional Hospital. Gardaí investigated the circumstances of his death. There was no evidence of foul play. Peter had suffered a heart attack. He was 47 years old. Friends and neighbours in Clonmel were devastated. People described Peter as a lovely man who'd never recovered from losing his daughter. The local paper described him as a justice advocate who had worked tirelessly for victims' rights in the wake of his family's tragedy. Anne Mulvaney from Advic said she was saddened by Peter's death. She spoke about how he'd found purpose in trying to help other families going through similar trauma. Local friends of Peter's gathered at the funeral home in Clonmel for prayers before his remains were brought home to Cove. Peter Keaney's funeral took place on Sunday at St. Coleman's Cathedral in Cove, the same cathedral where Shaola's funeral had been held 5 years earlier. He was buried in St. Coleman's Cemetery, in the same cemetery where Shaola rests, father and daughter reunited in death. Sheola Keaney was 19 years old when she died. She was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was hoping to go to university. She had dreams and plans and ambitions. She was described by everyone who knew her as someone special, someone who could light up a room, someone who lifted people up when they were down. She loved shopping, she loved her friends. She had what was described as a bomb site of a bedroom and a huge wardrobe, the kind of detail that makes people smile because it's so perfectly ordinary. She was sporty. She excelled at hockey at Rockwell College. She was outgoing and bubbly. She was, in the words of those who knew her, your normal, extroverted and slightly disorganised and at times giddy teenager. Shaola was just a normal 19-year-old woman. And that's what makes her murder so heartbreaking. She wasn't in the wrong place at the wrong time. She wasn't the victim of a random attack. She was killed by someone she trusted, someone she dated for a year and a half, someone she thought she knew. Thomas Kennedy pleaded guilty to murdering Sheola Keaney. He had strangled her to death in the early hours of the 14th of July 2006, then wrapped her body in refuse sacks and hid her under scrap metal in a laneway. Then went on to lie to the Gardaí and to her mother, suggesting search areas while knowing exactly where she was. Kennedy is serving a life sentence for Sheola's murder. He has never given full explanation for why he killed her. He told Gardaí it was on the spur of the moment, but the forensic evidence showed otherwise. Strangling someone to death while kneeling on their chest is not an accident. But this story isn't really about Thomas Kennedy. This is about Shaola. It's about a young woman whose life was stolen from her. It's about the family and friends who loved her and who still miss her. It's about a father who never got to walk his daughter down the aisle, who never got to see her graduate, who never got to meet his grandchildren. And it's about the importance of recognising the warning signs in relationships. Domestic violence and controlling behaviour in relationships often starts small. It escalates gradually. By the time you realise you're in danger, it can feel impossible to get out. The signs can be subtle at first. A partner who needs to know where you are all the time. A partner who gets jealous when you spend time with friends or family. A partner who puts you down, undermines your confidence, or makes you feel like you're not good enough. A partner who isolates you from the people who care about you. These behaviours don't always lead to physical violence, but they are warning signs and they should be taken seriously. In Ireland, 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. Many of those women are young, in their teens and 20s, in their first serious relationships. They may not recognise what's happening to them because they have no frame of reference. They may think that jealousy is a sign of love or that controlling behaviour is normal. It isn't. Peter Keaney spent the last 5 years of his life fighting for victims' rights, making sure other families would get better support than his family did. He wanted Sheola's death to mean something. He wanted it to help others. And then he died at just 47 years old, his heart broken by the loss of his only child. Today, Shaola and Peter Keaney rest side by side in St. Coleman's Cemetery in Cove. Nearly 2 decades have passed since Sheola's murder. But for those who knew and loved her, the loss has never faded. Their story is a tragedy, but it's also a reminder to listen when something doesn't feel right in a relationship. A reminder that help is available. A reminder that no one has to face it alone. Sheola Keaney's life mattered. Her death should not be in vain. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence or is in a controlling relationship, please reach out for help. In Ireland, you can contact Women's Aid at 1-800-341-900. This service is free, confidential and available 24/7. Thank you for listening to Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.